First thing I'm going to recommend is that you go play this game. It's not expensive. I actually got it for like $3 during this Steam summer sale. And it's like 3 hours long. At least that's how long it took me to go through it. Probably a game worth playing through twice, in all honesty. It's got a bit of a Babylon 5 effect going on. But I mention that because a lot of the times when I recommend a game, I have to add an asterisk to that. Because, it's a long game, or it's an expensive game, or whatever. This is neither. There is no way to talk about this game without spoiling, ergo, I do actually recommend you pick this up. Now, I know you're probably hesitant. Let me go ahead and add one more thing, if you haven't already left to get the game, or watch it, or play it yourself. This is an RPG Maker game. Now, I say that up front because RPG Maker games have a hell of a stigma. It's right up there with fanfiction and DLCs and other concepts like that have just been dragged through the muck by people who do bad examples of them or misuse them or abuse them. Because we've all seen bad fanfics, right? So you could see how someone would use the term fanfic as an insult, right? I bet you've actually seen someone do that before. Maybe you've even done that before. RPG Maker games have pretty much the exact same stigma, and admittedly part of this comes from some of my friends who are a little more in the coding and programming side of video game development. I should say older friends, people I don't really interact with anymore. But I have also seen other people, just on a normal perspective, use the term, oh, it looks like an RPG Maker game, as an insult. All I'm going to say is that I feel while that stigma is certainly earned, because we've had a lot of really bad RPG Maker games over the years, it is not necessarily an absolute. It is not something that needs to... Is that a guarantee? Just because it is an RPG Maker game does not make it terrible. Now, I do actually have some issues with this game, and most of them I think have to do with that, but I don't think that's a flaw that should be considered. But this brings me to my point. One of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of works have really good core meat, and a lot of games have really good presentation, and a couple hundred of games, have both. And those are the really good ones, right? But this definitely feels like a game where the core meat is amazing. I've actually said before, I've had people ask me, well, you want to make so many games with your life, why not make one with RPG Maker? It's because I don't want to make a game like this. I know that sounds really, really weird, but what I mean by that is the core meat of this game is phenomenal. Very well written, very tight narrative, lots of, oh, that's what was going on, Babylon 5 effect going on, great dialogue. I have no complaint of the meat of this game, but the presentation is a little bit lacking. There were a few times, actually I ran into a bug once while I was playing through it, which kind of affected my progress, and it kind of devolved into find the pixel a few times, and I feel like a lot of that was because of the fact that it was stuck in an RPG Maker thing, lacking of presentation values. So, make of that what you will, but I would still recommend this. Now, for those of you who actually did watch this with me, you understand that this game did kind of make me... It hit me in the feels, I believe, is the proper term for that. And I am not particularly ashamed to admit that I did actually cry right at the end. For reasons I think I'll kind of build up to. So I mentioned the RPG Maker thing. They do some very clever things with it. First of all, obviously, point and click or, use the keys to move around. There are a couple of actual gameplay sections. Most of the time this feels more like a point and click adventure game than anything else. You go from point A to point B, you find the things you need to interact with, you do so. You get a very brief puzzle mechanic, which was either really simple or took me a couple of tries, depending on which particular puzzle I was on. There are a couple of stabs at gameplay, and I'm tired, excuse me. And each of those stabs was used to good effect. Para exemple, right at the beginning, there's this thing where the main doctor is out with these two kids, and they talk about how they like to role play as a knight and a mage. And so she sees this squirrel, and she's like, all right, squirrel, time to meet your maker. And then, the combat starts, because it's RPG Maker, and it has built-in turn-based or ATB, I forget which. Combat, I'm pretty sure it's turn-based. So, the health bars pop up, and, the combat music starts, and she's like, ha-ha! And then she's like, I will defeat you. And the kids are like, what are you doing? It's probably one of the more unique usages of the game engine in a way that wasn't intended that I've seen. It was very brilliant. There's also a little bit later where you have this Plants vs. Zombies thing, given the people involved in making this. That was probably a deliberate reference. Plus there's references all over the place in this game, which was very nice and very amusing. So there were a lot of times where they did clever, fun stuff with the gameplay. I'd say like 4 or 5 times total. So it's not like the gameplay was actively bad. It's just that it did get a little bit old at times trying to find the pixel. There were like 3 or so instances where I'm like, come on, I just want to find the thing to let me progress. And sometimes you have to click something and sometimes you just have to walk over a tile. And it's not exactly indicated other than by mousing over when it's one or the other. Excuse me. So let's talk about the machine that they use, which is actually really cool as a concept. My very first thought when I was looking at it was the Animus over in the Assassin's Creed series. Obviously different, but a similar concept. The idea that you read the patient's brain and then create a construct based on that and use connecting points, strong memories that connect between one memory and another in order to hop back through the patient's life until you get to the point where they are young enough and their memories are young enough that you can imbue the desire within them and then rewrite their memories. All of this is still in the machine. But then once those memories have been rewritten, those memories are then transferred to the actual patient, rewriting their real memories, and therefore letting them feel in their deathbed that they actually accomplished whatever it is they wanted to do. I have a topic about that too, but we'll get to that in just a moment. It's a cool concept, and I like how they go out of their way to try and explain it without going too quantum-y with it. Obviously, this is some science fiction level stuff, but it does make sense in my head, especially the way that the distinction between where the memories are being altered. I like the fact that they have total control of those memories in the construct rather than in the person's mind, because that makes a degree of sense to me. If you're constantly rewriting a person's memories or affecting that as if it was a holodeck, you'd think there'd be some consequences and side effects of that. So instead you get one read, to use the basic computing term. You read and then you write as much as you need to over here in the environment, and then once you're done, you export it out here to one write. So what I meant to say was one read and one write to the actual brain. And that makes sense. Think of it like a CD, basically. You know what CDs are, right? Right? CDRs? Anybody? No? I'm sorry, this is really off topic. I was thinking about this today. When my mom was my age, I was approaching high school. Just a weird thought of the day. It's like, God, I don't feel that old. Really, I don't. So, let's just get into this. Actually, before I go into this, there's 2 things I want to praise about the game's design. Obviously, you're very limited in your tool set when you make an RPG Maker game. It's one of the reasons I praised the earlier usage of the combat as like a nice little joke. They even used the airship mechanics, I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, of the RPG Maker for one particular sequence. And like I said, they do some clever stuff with it. One of the things they do that was really brilliant, in my opinion, is the further back in the memories you go, the more vague people you see, and the closer the fog is. They have this little effect, which is the fog of his memory. In other words, he doesn't remember anything past that area. Now, for gameplay purposes, that obviously limits where you're playing. But think back, when you were 10 or 15 or whatever, a while ago, and I want you to remember something from that period of your life. I can think of something right now. The school I went to when I was in 4th grade back in Colorado, I can remember that right now off the top of my head. But while I remember the house and the road I used to walk through the snow, and then up, and then there's the school, I remember that whole stretch of land very clearly because I used to walk to school. But if you asked me what was down that road this way, I'd be like, So I like the representation of this fog, because our memories aren't perfect. We don't remember everything about where we went or what we did. We may remember specific details, like I just told you. I can tell you quite a bit, actually, about that road. but we don't remember everything around it. We don't remember any of the side stuff. And so there's this fog there to represent that. And the faces thing is brilliant. While I was streaming this, I used an analogy an example that I'm going to use for you right now. When was the last time you went to the grocery store? For me, it was yesterday. So this is really relevant for me because I couldn't tell you the faces of most of the people I went by at that grocery store. And I'm actually a fairly observant guy overall. But I couldn't tell you the faces of just about anyone I encountered that day. I could probably pick out like a few if I tried. And that was yesterday. And I love that because, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but that's kind of how my memory works in general. I can remember the faces of people who matter. I can remember the faces of people who I was interacting with or who had left some kind of impact on me. But if you were to hop into my memories and rewatch those days, everyone else would probably just be kind of a blur, right? And in the game, they represent this by them being these blurred out sprites, which are basically just a person. Occasionally, you might be able to tell, like, relatively how old they are, or whether they're male or female. But that's about the only fact that is recorded. Person who has a gender, and that's it. And I love that. I love that presentation. There's a lot of... I mentioned earlier this game doesn't have great presentation values, but they do a lot of clever stuff with the limited resources they have, and I do enjoy that. So, before I get to my first big topic, I might drop a controversy box on this one. Before I get to my first big topic, I just want to say one of the things... I walked into this game almost completely blind. I didn't even know it was an RPG Maker game until I fired it up. But one thing I did know is that it had been brought up in the games are art thing. This game, Journey, Flower, and... oh, God, I can never remember the name of the other one. There's another one. Now, of course, if you're watching this, your reaction to this is probably going to be, well, of course games are art. Because you have a brain. But I have heard people actually argue in the past that games are not art. Usually not in person. I'm going to go ahead and be honest about that. Most people I interact with in person don't make that argument. But I was actually part of a debate. This was a few years ago at this point. 6 years ago? God, it's been a bit. Where we're discussing are games art. And this was obviously not one of the games that was brought up then because this game wasn't out back then. But the whole argument that was being made was centered around the idea that a commercial product cannot be considered an artistic work of art, that it would degrade the concept of things that are artistic. The counter-argument that was made to that was, so a movie isn't art? And that, of course, now the funny thing was the counter-argument to that was, well, no, older movies are art. I bring this up, though, because it is my opinion that one of the reasons this game in particular is used, and in more recent times, as the games are actually art, part of that debate, is because this feels like a game that wasn't really made to make money. Or, to be more accurate about my statement, it wasn't a game where the primary focus was making money. I've said this before, and I will say this again. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make money in your job or your work or whatever it is you do. We kind of need to for us to function. That's how an economy works. Even if it wasn't money, we would still need goods and services to keep functioning because we can't provide everything for ourselves, can we? So, nothing wrong with that concept, but I have always fervently believed, as far back as I can remember, no pun intended, that if your primary focus is money, if the reason you're doing something is to make money and maybe also to make something else, then that tends to lead to a worse result, especially when it comes to creative works. If you make a game or a show or a book or a movie to make money, then in my opinion, and I have seen examples of this in my life, I'm sure you have too, in my opinion, it's just a lesser work. But if you make something a creative work to be a creative work, and then also to make money, putting the priorities in that order, it tends to be a better work because there's real passion, real care, real effort that's been put into it. I know some of you are just going to be looking at me when I'm saying this and just being like, well, duh. But you'd be surprised how often I have to defend this point when it comes to discussing this with others. I believe very firmly that this was a game that was made to be a creative work, to be a work of passion and effort, and then also to make some money, that priority order. And I think it shows in just about every aspect of it, other than the fact that it's an RPG Maker game. I just wanted to get that out there. Next point, and so let's. Oh my gosh! All right, so I mentioned that this is a Babylon 5 effect type game. There's a couple of things that I actually was noticing as I was going through because it's me and I was ruminating, so I had full analysis mode on. Like, I did actually notice the bunk bed. I was just confused by it. I didn't actually put two and two together until the car hit. Um, so I love the subtlety of that foreshadowing. I love the fact that he has kind of started forgetting about Animorphs. That was another nice little touch. The fact that she keeps calling him Joey, I had no idea what was going on with that. Didn't have a clue. But one of the other bits that I really liked, and this is so obvious I felt stupid for pointing it out on the stream, is the fact that he didn't even mention the moon the entire first time through the memories. For someone who has written down has written out to this foundation and written a contract for them to send him to the moon, why is it not even present in his memories once? For that matter. And now, of course, you might be like, well, of course, there are lore reasons that might be true, but from a narrative perspective, you don't do that kind of thing on accident unless it's bad writing, and I don't think this is bad writing. So, of course, I was picking up on that. Excuse me. But one of the things that I want to add is that I do love the character development of basically everyone involved. I'll be talking more. I don't actually have too much to say about Johnny. I have a point about him later. I'll talk about Johnny, Isabel, River, and that's kind of it later. But I want to mention the two main leads. Rosaline, I think. I don't remember her name that well. And Watts, Neil Watts. Now, Watts is my favorite character. Let me just go ahead and say that right up front. I do like the fact that he's the one who's the deadpan snarker, who's making jokes and kind of trying to lighten the mood the whole time. And the reason why is because I have several family members who are in the medical profession. Now, I know what does that have to do with anything? Let me tell you a story real quick. My aunt, who is a nurse, and they weren't married at the time, but the man who would eventually become her husband, were on their way to one of their first dates. It was like one of the first 3 dates they were going on. Nice shoes, nice dress. They came across a car wreck. By the way, he was with, I forget what it's called. It's like the emergency medical department of the fire department. I can't remember what that's called. Emergency services or something like that. Anyways, they're both medical, is what I'm trying to say. Both in that profession. That's how they met. So they come across a car wreck on the side of the road. They both jump out and try to help the people. And, I mean, it's bad. I'm not actually going to describe the whole thing to you, but, a lot of blood. And so so what happens is they end up telling this story to the rest of the family. And the rest of the family's like, oh my God, what happened? Are they okay? And my aunt says, no, they're dead. Really casual like. Because what was on her mind was her screwed up shoes. Because she got blood all over her dress and her shoes. Now, that may sound callous, but if you know anybody in the medical profession, you know that that's kind of what tends to happen. You get to the point where you can't really let it all get to you the way it does get to normal people who aren't dealing with it on a daily basis. So everyone develops some kind of defense mechanism to deal with the constant trauma and the constant tragedy and the constant grief and depression and sadness and all that stuff. And most medical people I know personally, including family members, tend to become snarky, I guess is the word I want to put that. They get that dark comedy thing going on. So it makes perfect sense to me that Watts would be that kind of a person, trying to make light of the whole thing and trying not to take it seriously when it is so obvious, especially having completed the game now, that he is the one who actually cares more than his compatriot. Now, obviously she does care. I'm not saying she doesn't. But we see in the two of the most common coping mechanisms when it comes to dealing with this kind of crap on a regular basis. Because honestly, think about this for a moment. Think about what it would be like to do what these two do on a regular basis. Going out to dying people and hopping into their memories and seeing their lives and interacting with them and then trying to alter them to fulfill their last wish. Think about you think this game was sad. Think about that on a regular basis. Think about that as the norm. And you can kind of see why they both react the way they do. She kind of puts up the walls professional, cold, aloof, and he just kind of tries to make a joke of it all. And of course that makes sense because once both of them care enough to actually try to really do the job here, and by the way, I did see this coming, the whole we need to get rid of River thing, just wow. I thought she was going to erase her outright, not remove her. But anyways, once you see that, it makes sense how they both react the way they do. He just gets passionate. He's like, no, we can't do this. This is wrong. This is morally wrong. Whereas she says, no, we have to do this. There's legal concerns here, so we're going to do this and hope that things work out, basically. And she flat out says, I didn't know things would work out. This was a gamble. But had to keep the job going. There's legal concerns here. But I did like his character quite a bit. He grew on me throughout the course of the thing. But I digress. Let's talk about the moral thing, because I've kind of been building up to this point. What is the morality of the Make-A-Wish Foundation? I know I'm just opening up a can of worms here, and I don't give a damn, because it's relevant to the game. That is effectively what these people do. They hop into your brain and give you some really happy, nice memories before you die. Something to make you feel like you fulfilled some dream or some concept or whatever. Now, in this case, it's kind of mentioned that this isn't a completely normal case because it took them so long. So they basically slid in right at the finish line there. I'm under the strong impression, especially given the side episodes, which I have glanced at, by the way, although I will not be covering in full here, that normally they get to them and they have a few extra hours or days or whatever of being able to have those new memories, and then they pass on. Now you might be like, well, what's so wrong about that? You'd be surprised how often the morality of this comes up. And I specifically mentioned the morality because that's the relevant point. I'm going to be referencing my aunt here again in a minute. The argument has been levied in the past that boils down to, why waste the resources? Why spend the time and the effort and the funding and the people? Why spend all of these resources on a dead person? They are dying. That is the whole point of the Make-A-Wish concept. That's the whole point of the Sigmund Corporation and what they do. This person is dying. This is not an attempt to save them. This is not an attempt to garner something, to pull something out of them in order to be a lasting thing, not to duplicate their mind into an AI or to try and preserve their memories for future historians. No, this is just to make them happy in their dying moments. And that's all. So why waste the resources? You can probably understand why I call this a morality question and why this is what is being put into a thing there. Because it's basically, my opinion, boils down to compassion versus practicality. Because it's not actually that practical to waste resources on the dying. Not really. It is, however, more compassionate to try and make sure that someone dies in comfort or peace or happiness, right? I mean, God, this is a very old concept at this point. Now, I'm not going to... there's actually a related topic here that I want to build into. It's a segue eventually to, but I just want to share this. There was... You know what, it occurs to me I probably shouldn't name names. So I'm not going to say what the debate was about or the hospital involved or anything like that. All I'm going to say is that I was once able to watch a live debate, which my aunt was involved with, that had to do with the morality and ethics of a certain issue. Okay, we're just gonna leave all the specifics out the door. There's really no reason to get into that. Let's not bring the controversial box down for this one. Her argument was very basic. She's not kind of the how do I put this? She's not the kind of person who tries to compromise. She believes in what she believes in. The end, right? That's my aunt. Great person. But so she didn't try to compromise or meet them halfway on this. The argument she levied, which I'm going to paraphrase to you, was, we are not robots. We do feel things emotionally and physically. We do have concepts such as pain or such as loneliness and such as misery. And as a consequence thereof, we should not stop doing what that was about any more than we should stop giving patients pain medication or trying to ease a patient's suffering while we diagnose them, or when we put them in for surgery or whatnot. Because we are not robots. We care about each other. And I liked that argument. It was a nice argument because it is basically the compassion side of the two things I mentioned. To quote Babylon 5, or rather to quote myself talking about Babylon 5, nobody really wants to die alone on the cold metal floor. So do you waste the resources in order to make someone die comfortably? Now, it's probably pretty obvious what my opinion on this is. But I'm man enough to admit that is merely my opinion and not a definitive, and I would be curious to hear what you guys think on this matter. But there is another slightly stickier issue here. See, the Make-A-Wish Foundation in real life makes things happen for people, here, in the fleshy realm, if you will. What these people do in the game, they go in and fiddle with your memories, so that you think you accomplished something, or you think you did something, and then you die. That is a little bit of a stickier situation because it involves memory alteration. Now, as we see, thanks to the mini-sodes, I think they call them, the mini episodes that came out, this is not a universally praised concept. There's actually a protest that happens in one of them with people who are just not happy about this concept at all. Now, we could guess the whys and the wherefores of that, but the mere fact that this involves memory alteration is kind of, I think, the biggest issue here. This actually, God, I keep referencing Babylon 5, but this reminds me of the death of personality over in Babylon 5. You are effectively rewriting someone. Now, you're doing it for what is ostensibly a good cause. You're doing it, Rosaline and Watts both have this exchange at one point where I got into this business to help older people die happy. They're doing it as a charity. They're doing it, obviously they're being paid, but they're doing it as a kindness. They're doing it to help people. But you can see why not everyone would look at it that way. And of course, this is the kind of technology that is extremely dangerous. It would be so easy for this to be used on someone who isn't dying, or on anyone for any reason whatsoever. If you can really do this kind of memory rewrite, granted it takes some work, it's not like you just go, all right, their brain's hacked. But you could do it. I don't even really feel the need to discuss this issue properly because it's so obvious of an issue of why this would be such a big deal. But let's get back to that earlier point I mentioned about the protest. Why do you think people would protest this? I only have one theory off the top of my head. And again, as ever, I'd love to hear yours. My theory is that it's a lie. Most people... I shouldn't say it that way. I shouldn't presume. Most of the time when I hear this argument, the argument is on the side of the truth rather than the lie. The argument being, which is better, a harsh truth or a comforting lie? The game itself actually talks about comforting lies when Johnny tries to lie to River, saying, we've totally got the money to do this, because he's trying to comfort her, trying to give her some comfort in her dying moments. Think about that for a minute. Now, obviously, it's not a complete one-to-one parable because he was trying to save her life with that lie. But the kernel of that idea is still there. So which is better, comforting lie or harsh truth? Now, in most of life, I hear that argument. I almost always hear that the harsh truth is the better action. I've actually played through several games and ruminated on a few games where the Aesop of the game is you need to face the truth even if it's bad, right? This is a slightly different situation, though, because they're dying. And again, this isn't about comfort, trying to give them some comforting lie that will affect or ruin their life or make them do wrong things or anything like that. It's not a placebo situation where you're selling snake oil to people so they stop seeking treatment, right? Instead, this is you are past help, so let's try and make you happy in your final moments. So I think it's a little bit more of a gray situation. And for that reason, I'm not actually sure why those protests are really there. And I really would love to hear if you guys have any thoughts about that. Let's talk about Joey. I know that's not an easy segue, but let's just move on to Joey. I'm going to quote something. It's from Final Fantasy IX. I actually wrote it down word for word so I wouldn't misquote it. To be forgotten is worse than death. That quote has always resonated with me because, for whatever reason, I don't know if this is just a thing with me or how I am, but the idea of being forgotten and not being in other people's memories has always really, really bothered me. I used to have nightmares about that concept. This is not a joke. I used to have nightmares that I'd encounter someone who was very close to me, a close family member or a close friend or whatever, and they didn't know who I was. And that has always bothered me. And the idea of being forgotten really gets to me. So, I can't even begin to process what would happen to me if I accidentally killed someone like, my favorite son in this case, with what happened with the mother. I don't even know how to begin to process that. It is implied, though not stated outright, that she didn't process it, that she just went, whoo, and completely lost it. Went actually insane as a consequence of that tragedy. And keeping in mind, she was kind of a horrible parent from what we see prior to that. Granted, we only see a little bit, and we see it through the lens of a young boy. But, and I mentioned this during the stream as well, I was reminded of Denethor over in Lord of the Rings, with how he had his favorite son, and then there was the other son. And it was always phrased like that. It was always framed in favorite son, other son. And that's how Johnny was. And we see that so many of the things that Johnny had been doing or showing in terms of his personality or his likes or whatnot were actually things that Joey liked that have been forced upon him. And again, this is implied, but I personally believe that what was happening was his mother kind of forced him to act like his brother after the memory alteration thing, which was probably also forced on him by his mother. Her referring to him as Joey, I get the idea that she constantly was like, here, have these Animorphs things. You like Animorphs so much. At his wedding day, she gave him an Animorphs comic. For God's sakes. And what's funny is, I mentioned earlier the subtleties of this game. First of all, at one point, River is like, why don't you read Animorphs anymore? He's like, well, I'm not interested in that anymore. I guess I just grew out of it. Except he was never interested in Animorphs. And when he's talking about it in the bookstore, he can't even remember who one of the Animorphs, what animal one of the Animorphs turned into. Because why would he? He was never into it that much. It's really messed up. And in so many ways, I'm not even sure what else to say about that. The idea of him never really remembering his brother until the rewrite, of course. And the idea, and furthermore, this is where we start to segue, the idea of not remembering his first meeting with River, when it is so very obvious based on the game that she remembered her first meeting with him, although unfortunately, thanks to her issues, she was not capable of properly explaining that to him. Segue. I should just start saying that during these ruminations. Segue. This game does a really good job of shining a light on both sides of the mental, neurological disorder coin. On the one half of the coin, we see a pretty good portrayal of people who have some form of neurological issue, and on the other half of the coin is everyone else. Now, I'm not saying that to try and put a big dividing line between these people. I have actually had to. I shouldn't say it like that. I have had interactions with people who have significant mental disabilities in my life. I actually have been very close to someone who was severely bipolar, to the point where I actually had bite marks from one particular incident where they were just completely losing it. This is not a joke. And it's hard to explain what it's like going through that from both perspectives, trying to be understanding of both sides of this. When this person I mentioned, when I explained to them what had happened, the previous incident with the bites, they were in shock. Because that's kind of what happens when you have something chemically or electrically not connecting correctly in your brain. I mean, I'm really summarizing these ideas, obviously, and these are very complicated situations, but that's my point. This game does a really good job of showing how complex this situation is. First of all, we see how a lot of, I hate to use this word, normal people, neuronormals, don't know how to act around people who have some kind of mental disorder. They don't know what they should say. They don't know how to cope with it. They don't know how to deal with it. And Johnny flat out admits, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to deal with this, and it's kind of hard dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. Because it is. That is a difficult thing to deal with. But of course, on the other side of the things, we get this wonderful diatribe from Isabel. She gives this great speech about how she had her issues caught when she was very young. By the way, the game goes out of its way to never name a specific neurological disorder. I think that was a smart move on the game's part. She mentions how she caught this when she was young, and so she has been practiced at pretending to be normal for most of her life. And she laments that. She laments that she's not even entirely certain who she is anymore because she never got a chance to be her. She was always trying to be this person, this mask that is able to interact with others normally. And of course we see in River someone who is not able to interact with others normally. She is someone who very much has trouble just functioning on a day-to-day basis, but still manages it. It's a wonderful presentation, in my opinion. But that brings me to another interesting point, and this came to me after I'd actually finished the game, and the game keeps processing in my head before I start doing the rumination. And as I was thinking about it, I realized that there is this amazing connection between Johnny and Isabel. Now hear me out. Isabel has, since a child, pretended to be someone else, and has lost touch with who she really is. Now, in her case, it's because she has a neurological disorder, and she has to go through these pacings and go through this practice and probably counseling, they never say that outright, in order to try and cope with this. Johnny had chemicals shoved into his brain to block out his youth, to the point where he doesn't even remember that he ever had a brother, let alone other things about that, or about who he was. And as a consequence, is missing. You see the connection between these two characters? It's one of the more brilliant things, I think, that the game did, because, well, because this allows us, of course this is foreshadowing, but this allows us to basically hear Johnny confess how he feels, except they can't actually let Johnny do that because he doesn't know how he feels. He is actually completely lost who he actually really was. And River tries to reconnect with him on that on several levels, but can't outright say it because of her own issues. But by putting his situation into the mouth of another, we can effectively hear Johnny's entire lamentation about what has happened with his life in the voice of Isabel. It's really well done. I'm sure there's a term for that, literary term. I don't know what it would be. But the funny thing I love, and of course, segue, the funny thing I love about this, I mean, I could just praise this game for a while, but I think I'm just going to wrap up my notes. Praise, 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 praise. Seriously. I love the fact that we do this with the memories, too. It's a nice touch. On the first run-through, on the face of it, the idea that River would want to refuse treatment for a house, for a lighthouse, is ridiculous and frankly stupid. But once we go through the second time and we understand everything, it becomes so much more powerful. Because she's in the same general situation that Isabel was in and that Johnny is in. She has lost something. She makes these little origami, and she tries to remind him of their connection to each other and the him that she is. She tries to rebuild this whole thing that he has been absent of this entire time throughout their lives, because she doesn't know how to properly communicate it to him. The whole idea of the lighthouses, each star in the sky being one of these other lighthouses, and the symbolism of the fact that, I forget exactly how they phrase it, but the idea that these stars have so much, they're so distant to us. These lighthouses are so distant to us that it's so difficult to connect. The idea that River herself feels in her daily life so distant from people and so distant from what's around her as she tries to connect with people. I love the idea that it was more important to her to try this one last time to reconnect with Johnny, to have that one last connection in whatever manner she was capable of doing. And then she fails at it. And then his memories are rewritten and then he dies. But I love it because it goes back to that age-old question of what life is. I don't mean what living is. I'm sorry, let me explain my terminology. I've always divided it into three categories: survival, existence, living. But I've always said that living, what defines that highest tier, is dependent on you, the individual. That only you can decide what living is for you. And the question has been levied for many years, and this goes back as long as we've had philosophy. What is life? Is life worth it? Is it worth attempting failure or risking death to try to live rather than to merely exist? And of course, the contrary question, what is the point of existence if you cannot live? We see in River that she chose to try to have this connection, to have what for her would be life. And that, of course, brings us back to the morality of the memory alteration. Was it a good thing that in his final moments he remembered not only his brother, but his connection to her? Because he did. Altered memories or no, that it was within his mind to both remember his brother and remember his connection as a child to River. Because remember, Rosaline didn't get rid of River until the, I guess, mid-school or high school, I'm not sure which it was, school age, after they'd already met and been interacting. There's also a little bit where it is implied that the two reconnect after, whether in heaven or as spirits or ghosts or whatever the hell you want to call it, And I admit, I kind of like the idea that the only reason that happened was because of that reconnection, thanks to the memory alteration. I like how that lines up. This game really got to me. This game really got to me. For those of you who had been watching the stream, you know this, because I had to mute the mic. I was just, wow. And then I went to bed like right after because it was late. Yeah, anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this rumination. I don't even remember who requested it. I'll look it up, of course, to put it in the credits. You'll be seeing in a moment, but I hope you've enjoyed. And I will be seeing you next time with a slightly less depressing game. See you around, guys.